great harbour of Cork is known throughout the marine world for its deep and safe anchorage, and of course not to mention its picturesque beauty. When the Vikings sailed into the harbour over 1,000 years ago, they would have seen its surroundings covered by a mass dense forest, abundant with wildlife and fowl of the air. When the Anglo-Normans arrived some 2 centuries later, the scene was more or less the same. The first major important action that was to change the face of the harbour and its landscape occurred at the close of the 18th century, when the country was threatened by a French invasion during the Napoleonic War. This caused England to fortify the harbour. The first battery, known as Cove Fort, was erected in the area now called Belmont. 2 other forts were placed at the mouth of the harbour: Fort Carlisle on the eastern side and Fort Camden at the western side, and a larger one was erected on Spike Island. Due to the great demand for housing to accommodate families of naval and military personnel, and of course business interests to meet the demands for supply of food and material, Cove and its neighbouring little villages developed into towns. During these years, the harbour became an important fuelling and assembly point for naval and commercial ships, and up to 300 vessels of all shapes and sizes could be seen at anchor on any given day. By the time of Queen Victoria's visit in 1849, the harbour had become one of the most important ports in the North Atlantic route. Tall ships called to transport convicts to Australia and to carry Irish emigrants to North America. Later, the early transatlantic steamers, and finally the great ocean liners such as the ill-fated Titanic and the Lusitania, continued the task of carrying the Irish to new lives in new lands. To cater for these vessels, ship repairing yards and docks sprang up along the harbour. The largest of these was at Passage, where the SS Sirius was built, and it became the first steamer to cross the Atlantic Ocean from east to west in 1838. In more recent years, you had Verome at Rushbrook, where vessels up to 74,000 tons were built. Des Daly had a long association with the dockyard.
I spent over 20 very pleasant and busy years at the Verome Cork dockyard. I started there in 1960. I was there for the building of our first ship, which was a merchant vessel, and indeed it earned its money in years afterwards, but it was the first of many ships. We built one ship, a 74,000 tonner. We built several ships for our own navy, but the history of that dockyard goes back many, many years. It was, as a matter of fact, the original dockyard was built in the mid-1850s by a man called Wheeler, and it lasted until 1928, when it closed down, and it reopened in 1941. Now, it closed in 1928, and a lot of the machinery that was there at the time was moved away elsewhere. But the graving dock, which is literally a large swimming pool where the ships come in to be repaired, the Cove people maintained it by literally using it as a swimming pool. So when it came to 1941, it was, shall we say, usable. All they had to do was install the machinery, etc. But in 1941, the war was already, the Second World War, it was 2 years old, and shipping got very difficult. In fact, Ireland didn't own any ships. So the government at that time bought second-hand ships where they could, and brought them over to the swimming pool, which of course turned out to be a very busy ship repairing dock. And the ships were repaired there, and they brought the necessary requirements to Ireland, food and machinery, and you think of it, those ships brought it to Ireland during the war.
When did the actual building start then, Des?
It lasted then, it continued ship repairing right through the 50s, and Verome arrived in 1959. And he built the first dock, and the first ship was built and we'll say finished in December 1961. And that was the first of many, as I said. And we built Navy ships, we built passenger ships, we built
all sorts of seagoing.
All sorts of seagoing vessels.
Right.
And then we built some equipment for the drilling, oil drilling operations out off the coast here.
Oh, really? Yeah. How many people would have been involved at any one time?
Oh, we had, at its peak, we had 1,200. We had 10 to 1,200 constantly between those years, 1960s until it closed down in 1984. So it gave very good employment. And of course, it was mostly men, because shipbuilding is not the work that women would take to very well. So the value, the economic value to the area was enormous. And I could go on talking about it for a long time. But indeed, it was sad when it closed down. But one of the reasons it closed down is the shipbuilding became very expensive here in Ireland, as compared or contrasted with Japan or Korea and other countries. And indeed, England now is having a very tough time in its shipbuilding. Most of the yards are closed down. And it is not the business to be in here in Ireland. Not shipbuilding. Ship repairing, yes, but not shipbuilding.
Not alone is the harbour a safe haven for ships, but it is also a hive of industry and commerce. And it is one of the most important industrial regions in the country. Here in the harbour you will find multinational and state-owned companies, as well as family business concerns. It also has a refinery at Whitegate, a prison on Spike Island, the headquarters of the Irish Naval Service and Irish Steel on Haulbowline, a ferry terminal at Ringaskiddy, pharmaceutical plants, as well as a wildlife park on Fota Island. Looking back over the centuries, the harbour has witnessed many spectacular events, but nothing to match the tall ships race of 1991, when ships of all shapes and sizes filled the harbour, reminding us of other days. I'm standing here on the quays of Cove, where thousands of emigrants stood with their worldly belongings, waiting for the tenders to take them to the tall ships or liners who were waiting for them in the mouth of the harbour. For many of them, it was the last foot on home ground before they left for distant shores. And if the quays could talk today, they would tell of the cries of anguish as those people said goodbye to their loved ones, many of them who were never to return. From 1845 to 1960, over 2.5 million adults and children emigrated from Ireland via Cove, on coffin ships, early steamers, and finally on the great ocean liners. Many of them would have arrived in Cove on horse and traps just like this one. A dramatic exhibition of the origins, history and legacy of Cove was recently opened at the old railway station. Michael Colophy is operations manager of the Queenstown Story. Michael, can I begin by asking you, how did the idea for a heritage centre first come about in Cove?
Well, the need was seen to develop tourism in Cove Valerie, and the Cork Enterprise Board got a feasibility study done on the town. And when they looked at it closely, they saw what a great story was here. And from there, they got a marketing company to assess what could be told, where it could be told, and to what extent funding would be required. So this building that you're in now, which was originally the customs clearance area for the liners, was available. It was derelict at the time, and they felt that this was the most suitable place to lay the story. You can imagine that all the liner passengers and immigrants from about the 20s onwards would have travelled through this building. And so they put the plans together through the European Regional Development Funds, and were supported by that, the local county council grants through Board Fáilte, and also through contributions from the local people here in Cove. And it took about 5 years from the seed idea to what you see now. And we opened up on the 1st of March this year, and we have been going about 11 weeks.
Of course, one cannot think about Cove without thinking about the great tragedies like the Lusitania and the Titanic.
Valerie, we have a complete section dealing with the tragedies, and we start with the tragedy of the Titanic, and we've recreated a deck of the Titanic. And when a person goes on board, they will see the first image is a striking image from the Father Brown collection of the Titanic berthed here in the harbour. And underneath it is the line that God himself could not sink this ship. And from there you go through various images, again from the Father Brown collection. And he had sailed from Southampton to Queenstown and got off here. And also all the list of the names of the people who got on here, 123 of them, and they're signified as to whether they died or were survived the tragedy. And from there we go directly into the Lusitania 3 years later, and we've recreated that by recreating the Queen's Hotel, which is now the Commodore Hotel. And in there the bodies were brought ashore and they were laid out in the bedrooms there and prepared for burial. And over 150 people are buried here in the town from the Lusitania, 80 of them in a mass grave. And again, it's a huge emotional appeal for people because these are two of the greatest maritime disasters of all times, and it's uncanny that the Queenstown would have a relationship with both.
Now, the reaction of some of the American people coming back has been quite extraordinary.
It has been incredible, really. I mean, going through with people and the emotional attachment for the place, and to go through, because they really feel part of the experience that their ancestors would have had, and they can see for themselves the reasons why they went out, and particularly how they travelled out, and the endeavours of their ancestors to make a new life in a new world. The conditions here at home at the time, and both political and also dealing with the famine era, and that is one particular area that really gets to people's emotions. And it's not something that we would have envisaged that the impact would have been so great, but we're delighted that people are taking it on as such a real story and such a human story and enjoying it in that fashion.
Now, this is stage one. What is stage two of the Heritage?
There are many plans for the development of Cove and for the Heritage Trust. We would like to see a steam train operating from Cork to Cove, and we would like to see the whole Victoriana type atmosphere start even in the train station in Cove. And as people come down along the beautiful line down around the harbour, that they will get a feel for coming for somewhere really special and develop the town into a heritage town. There are a number of buildings in the town that we would be anxious to take over and make as part of the overall atmosphere and excitement of a heritage town, dealing with, again, the core mass emigration theme and developing into how people reacted when they got into the new worlds, the type of life that they made for themselves. And then there is areas down along the harbour which we would like to see developed as well.
So is Cove confidently looking forward to the future?
Very much so. I think you see with the return of the liners again, and they haven't really been coming in on schedule since the 60s. And the QE2 comes in on June 20th, which is always a great exciting day in the harbour. And even on a Sunday now, and with the new Cross River Ferry operating between Passage and Carrigallow, many people are making their Sunday trip into Cove, which is a whole new venture again, and we have street entertainment provided. So there's a strong service culture emanating, and there's a strong tourism culture emanating. And when we're out at the moment dealing with the American tour operators and the people who are influencing large numbers of people to come to Ireland, they are all talking about Cove and the Queenstown story and getting to see it. And I think eventually it will be a place that people will have to see if they're crossing the Atlantic to coming to Ireland.
And doesn't old Cove look charming there, watching the wild waves motion, leaning her back up against the hill and the tips of her toes in the ocean? Well, that's how one poetic emigrant saw Cove early one morning as he sailed back into the harbour that in all probability he thought he would never see again. As Irish towns go, Cove is quite a modern town. It stands on the southern slopes of Great Island in the Diocese of Cloyne, and it developed from a fishing village in the 18th century. Earlier records tell us it was known as the Great Island of Barry, due to the influence of the great Norman family of Barrys who set up their headquarters in the area. In the centuries that followed, various families also achieved dominance on the island, such as the Hodnetts, Meads, Smith-Barrys and the Brodricks, and many contributed to the commercial life of Cove. Jim Donegan is the current president of the Cove and Harbour Chamber of Commerce. Jim, as president of the Cove and Harbour Chamber of Commerce, you've been involved in the commercial life of Cove for quite a long time, haven't you?
I started in Cove on the 1st of September 1950 as an apprentice solicitor, qualifying 4 years later, and continuing my connection with Cove since then.
What developments over the years have you seen in Cove?
Cove in the 1950s was a very busy town with the end of the liner traffic, so to speak, coming, and then it collapsed for a period and is now pulling up again to be what I would see as a future for the town as a family town. The advent or the initiation of the ferry in March this year has changed the whole town and the atmosphere of the town and the attitude of people in the town. And they're all participating now in senior development in the town. Likewise, Queenstown Heritage is attracting a very large number of people to the town and is certainly playing its part to allow tourists to come into the town and spend money in the town. That's what I see as the future of Cove. Other things are coming about, such as the developments of photo outside, and in relation to photo with the opening of the golf course, I can see further development in this area. This, of course, is all part of East Cork tourism, which in itself, between Youghal, Middleton and Cove, is going to open up a new era for tourists to stay somewhat bit longer in the area than they did heretofore.
Now, wearing your Admiral's hat, so to speak, you're also very involved in the sea. Tell me about that.
Well, I suppose that comes within the family. My grandfather was in the first Fastnet race in 1925 with my late father, and they had an opportunity of sailing the boat with just 5 people on board. That was a 50-foot boat at the time. Today, I was just looking at the cup that they won for coming third in the Fastnet in 1925. I'm trying to beat that challenge, but I think my opportunity of doing it is very slight. In fairness to them, there were 7 boats in that race. There are now over 300 boats in the race participating in it, so my challenge is harder in that way. Round Ireland, of course, is a beautiful race. It's 704 miles around Ireland. It's a very interesting race because you're close to the coastline all around Ireland, and certainly I enjoy that all the more. In Cork Harbour, we have the best racing facilities, and that applies insofar as the Port of Cork is concerned, because the Port of Cork in itself is one of the finest harbours in the world. And not alone have we racing facilities inside here, but outside the harbour, which can be raced in all conditions. It's very seldom that a race is cancelled in Cork Harbour. Last year we had 4 Cork Week, which has shown sailing both inside and outside the harbour, and fairly rough conditions at times, but very interesting racing.
With the arrival of Queen Victoria in August 1849, the name of the town, which was spelled C-O-V-E, was renamed Queenstown to commemorate her visit. By this time, the architectural development of the town began to copy features of the English south coast towns such as Brighton. Evidence of this can still be seen today in places like Westbourne Place and Roger Casement Square, where the beautiful memorial monument to the victims of the Lusitania is situated. It seems that the authorities of the day may have attempted to develop Cove as a seaside resort due to its reputation as a health resort, particularly in winter, because of its mild temperature. This being the fashion of the day, the nobility, the gentry and the middle class flocked to avail themselves of the health-giving air. The Reverend Charles Wolfe, a noted poet of the day, was one of these. He died in 1823 of consumption and lies in the old Clonmel graveyard just outside the town. Another notable figure was Father Theobald Matthew. He died in 1856 and is buried in Cork. The town of Cove didn't really develop or expand until the second half of the 19th century, and this was helped by the increased importance of the British naval station on Haulbowline Island and the military base on Spike Island. As married personnel did not live on the islands, and for them and their families, houses were built in Cove. And to add to its prosperity, a train service linking Cork was established here in 1862. With the increase of the Catholic community, Dr. William Keane, Bishop of Cloyne, decided to build his cathedral here. He commissioned Ashlin and Pugin, who were noted architects of the day, to design the building. Work commenced in 1868 and was completed in 1919. Dedicated to St. Colman, the patron saint of Cloyne, it dominates the southern slope of the town with its 300-foot elegant spire, where the carillon of bells are installed. This magnificent French Gothic-style building is one of the finest pieces of ecclesiastical architecture in the country, and for those who have entered or left the harbour, it has made a lasting impression. The interior is lavish in detail. The mouldings, carved capitals, stained glass windows and ornamentation gives it a very rich effect. During the First World War, Cove became a garrison town for the British Army, and so the town had reached its peak of prosperity. In 1920, the local council adapted the town's original name using the Irish form of spelling, C-O-B-H, Cove, but Queenstown continued in usage for a decade after. In 1921, the town was badly hit by the withdrawal of the British Navy following the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and in 1937-38, under another agreement, Britain relinquished her portal rights and all her token forces were withdrawn. On the outbreak of World War II, Cove was to suffer again when the transatlantic liners ceased calling at the harbour. After the war, however, they returned again, and the trade continued until the 1960s, when it more or less sailed into the archives of the past. This was due to the economic boom of the country, which was having at the time, and somewhat eased the flow of emigrants. The deep recession of the 80s, however, saw some of the great employers such as Ford's, Dunlop's and Verome close, and these closures were felt in Cove. So many were forced to take the emigrant trail, again, just like their forefathers. Today, however, the economic gloom is gradually lifting and is being replaced by a mood of optimism. If we take a look at the town itself, it's gearing itself for tourism. The museum, perched on a hill overlooking the harbour, formerly a Presbyterian church, was opened in 1973 and houses Cove's history. Cove streets, quays, parks and buildings are graced in Victorian elegance, and many of its hotels, pubs, restaurants and shops are dressed in old world charm. And of course the locals are always on hand to welcome the visitor, and also to tell us about the town and about its great sons and daughters, people like Jack Doyle or Sonia O'Sullivan. Pat O'Shea is manager of the Commodore Hotel, and he's lived here all his life. Pat, you've spent all your life in Cove. Can you tell me something about growing up here?
Well, during the war years, when I was born and reared, it was a very quiet town. Actually enough, with the World War II full swing in Europe, things were very quiet and very bad. Food was scarce. It was tough times. And we still got through our education. And when 1945 came, everybody celebrated. And the liners started to come back to Cove. This was a turning point in Cove, and I think it was great. The Americans were confined to America for 7 years, and boy, did they have some dollars to spend. So, unfortunately, I wasn't in business at the time, but it was nice to see the local shopkeepers all doing very well.
Pat, between the hotel and the liner traffic in Cove, you must remember quite a few characters.
Yes, we had the Laurel and Hardy pair, we had Eisenhower, we had several dignitaries from different countries, and of course our old Gael, Jack Doyle. Jack Doyle came to sing for us in the Commodore in 1972. And that's when I got to know Jack. And Jack ended up with a nice plaque to Jack Doyle just beyond where we're standing. And we brought his remains home and buried them in the local cemetery.
And of course, in more recent years, we have Sonia O'Sullivan.
Sonia, she's in her prime, and she's a long way to go, and she will go a long way.
And Cove's future, Pat?
Well, it's like Cinderella. It's just starting to bud now. After so many years of wars of one kind or another, we have the Heritage Centre starting here now, and we have what God gave us, a lovely natural harbour, and it's just beginning to blossom. A great time and great future for Cork, I think.
The earliest occupants to set foot on Spike Island were monks of the monastery built here by St. Cathach in the 7th century. And by the 15th century, the island became the property of laypersons, such as the Ronan family of Kinsale. After passing through many hands, the state acquired the freehold in 1897, and since 1938, it has been the property of the Department of Defence. Throughout its colourful history, the island was a noted place for smugglers. It was a convict depot, a military base, and now a prison. Looking near Cross is Haulbowline Island, where the headquarters of the Irish Naval Service and Irish Steel are based. Since it was first documented in 1602, the island has been occupied by military and naval personnel. It was here in 1720, a group of gentlemen and officers from the King's Navy founded the Water Club, which was to become the Royal Cork Yacht Club. Now based in Crosshaven, it has the unique distinction of being the oldest yacht club in the world. Situated on the eastern portion of the island is Irish Steel. This was established in 1938 as a private concern until it was nationalised in 1947 because of its strategic importance as the only steel mill in Ireland. I spoke with local historian Jack Toomey and I asked him about the wealth of history attached to Spike and Haulbowline.
Well, I can remember back to the time as a little boy I used to be taken over to Spike Island by my parents in the late 30s. And of course Spike means a lot to me because two of my grandparents were born there. On my mother's side, Daniel Sheehan, and on my father's side, his mother, who was Elizabeth O'Connor. Spike has had a varied history because originally it was built up as a fort by the British because they thought there might be an invasion of Napoleon to England through Ireland. So that's around 1790. And it came into prominence from there on. Of course, as you asked me the question about modern times, the great occasion here was 1938 when the island was taken over by the native Irish government. It was an occasion of great rejoicing, and the English flag was taken down and the tricolour replaced by the tricolour. There's no need to go into that because that's something that anybody can read in modern history book.
There is, of course, the prison on Spike Island today, Jack, but it isn't the first prison that was on the island, I gather.
Oh, by no means. The first prison was there in about 1870 on, in the case of the Fenians and that, felons, as the British were inclined to call them. Before they were transported to Van Diemen's Land. And of course the most famous prisoner at that time was John Mitchell. I remember as a little boy of 6, my grandmother, Elizabeth O'Connor, who was born on the island, telling me that as a young girl, in 1880, 17-year-old girl, she remembers the prisoners being brought over to Haulbowline, chained at their ankles and also at their wrists to build the granite buildings that are so prominent on Haulbowline today.
Where the naval base is now, they actually built that so from Spike, did they?
All those prisoners, yes, they did. They did the manual work. attached to building these buildings. To move on then, during the war years, Hall Bowling, of course, we started our own steelworks just before the war, and it was maintained during the war, and it's still in existence, although it has had its hiccups from time to time. But we're glad and assured by the present government that the workers over there need have no fear that we will have a steelworks for the foreseeable future, at any rate. The other side of the island, of course, is occupied by the naval service. The naval service, as we know today, came into existence in 1940. That was brought about by the war years, and we wanted to have our own protection, naval protection service. Hall Bowling is quite important from that point of view, and of course now, and since we joined the EEC, the emphasis has been more on fishery protection rather than of a proper naval service. It's more or less fishery protection will be its future.
Jack, while we were chatting earlier, you were telling me about the unusual names in Cove. Could you tell us something of how that came about?
Well, the unusual names like Erasmus and Cesarego, Lottie, and these type people, their great-grandfathers and further back, at around 1880 or maybe 1900, they jumped ship in Cove and married a local girl. And how that came about was the ship came into the old Rushbrook dockyard for repairs, and it might be there for 3 or 4 months. And they'd have met a local girl and became interested and probably fell in love with her. They then went on to rejoin their ship, and on the next journey back, which might have been for 12 months, and if the girl was still single and still interested, well, they jumped ship then, because there was a prospect of marriage in Cove and settling down. So that's how these people came to live in Cove originally. But of course, it is their great-grandchildren now, and that generation are living in Cove and have contributed a lot to the town over the years.
Just 10 miles down the road from Cork city centre is situated one of Europe's most modern wildlife parks, on Fota Island. It contains about 70 different species of wildlife from over 5 continents. The island itself was once the home of the Barrys, Earls of Barrymore, until it was purchased by the University College Cork in 1975. The Wildlife Park was established by the Zoological Society of Ireland with the primary aim of breeding endangered species. Throughout its 70 acres of beautiful countryside and woodland, visitors can enjoy the walks and can mingle with giraffes, zebras and antelopes as they roam freely, along with wallabies and many species of wildfowl. The Monkey Island has a fine collection of chimps, and cheetahs can be seen in their tree-shaded enclosures. For those who would be green-fingered, you can stroll around the beautiful well-kept gardens or view the internationally renowned Arboretum, where a collection of rare trees and shrubs from China, Japan, Australia and the Himalayas can be seen. Well, we've come to the end of our look at Cork Harbour and its 4 islands, each one in its own way having contributed to the history and the life of the area. And with such resources and enthusiasm there, the future of the harbour area seems assured.